where every clue hides a secret, and every secret has a story.
Thomas halted on the servants' corridor when a single, clear harp note cut the late evening hush and settled against the stone walls. Suspicion tightened his chest the way a hand might grip a sleeve. The note was precise, deliberate, and impossible coming from the closed nursery above. He stepped forward, boots whispering on the flagstones, and the sound unbent into a short phrase that ended on a minor chord. "Bridget, do you hear that?" he said without turning, and his voice knocked into the corridor like a pebble in a quiet pool. Bridget O'Connell paused with a stack of folded linens against her hip. She set them down on the narrow table and clicked her tongue. "Harp, Thomas. From the nursery. The door's bolted, is it not?" She used the key on her cord when she spoke the last word, as if naming the key might make it appear. The corridor smelled of boiled cabbage and coal smoke. The light was low and flicked by a single guttering lamp. Their discovery opened the problem plainly. A room kept sealed for years now gave music, and music meant someone or something inside could not be ignored. Within the next steps, Thomas gave 3 short orders without thinking. "Fetch the house candles. Rouse Mistress Evelyn. Bring the master from his study if he will come. Do not let anyone go upstairs alone." Each sentence was a motion of purpose. Suspicion pushed him into movement. He had arrived at Moonfall Manor only 2 hours before, sleeves damp from the sea wind, and the harp's note made him feel that something sealed at the house had been breached. The central problem showed itself. The nursery was bolted from the inside, the key missing, and music issued from within. That fact made stakes immediate: reputation, grief, and a truth someone had tried to lock away. They ascended to the landing in pairs. Thomas moved faster than Bridget guessed he would, fingers worrying the rim of his pocket watch. The landing before the nursery smelled of beeswax and old varnish. The banister bore a thin sheen of winter salt from boots. The nursery's door was a slab of pale oak with a tarnished brass bolt. It had been painted shut once, then oiled, then bolted. The bolt sat flush when Lady Evelyn opened the door. No, she did not open it. She came to them instead, black gloves on her hands, her jet brooch at her throat like a dark punctuation. Lady Evelyn's face carried the molded calm she preferred. She walked down the corridor with measured steps and placed her hand on the banister as though counting its groovistomus. She said, voice level, "What is it?" Her fingers smoothed the skirts of her morning gown as if that motion would steady her breath. Bridget answered before Thomas could. "Mistress, there is harp music from the nursery. The door is bolted from the inside, and the key is nowhere in the house where it ought to be." She the last half as a fact to be borne, rather than a speculation. Thomas met his mother's eyes. He saw the iron grey hair pinned in a twist, the widow's crease at her brow, the thin scar along the left cheekbone. He noticed how her lips tightened and how she tapped the jet brooch between 2 fingers once, twice. "Mother, this cannot be," he began. But Lady Evelyn cut him off with a single, small movement. "Do not force the nursery," she said. The sentence fell like an order carved in Isui: keep it closed for a reason. We will not become the sort of house that steals back its past for the sake of talk. Her tone carried authority, but a tremor ran the length of it. Her composure had small fissures. Thomas' suspicion shifted into a new tone, anger edged with incredulity. He had come back to his home to find it full of silence, and a silence now pierced. To be told to leave it sealed felt like a rebuke. He who ordered it sealed. "Mother." "Thomas." "Who put the bolt on? Who took the key?" The words came quick and blunt. His anger carried the ache of someone trying to fix what had been broken by hiding the pieces. Lady Evelyn's jaw set. "He did. It was an accident. It would have ruined us to speak." She stopped and could not finish. Her hand fell away from the brooch, and the skin showed white where her grip had been tight. Bridget's hand went to the iron key at her waist, a worn piece that had turned many locks. She moved a step toward Lady Evelyn and then retreated, a hesitation that was an admission. "Mistress," she said, voice lower. "He kept a thing. I thought I kept it for you." The words broke off. Thomas felt the room tilt. The suspicion inside him broadened into the sense that concealment had not only been ordered but aided. They argued in whispers that became sharper edges. "You had no right. Thomas, you took that key out of the study, Bridget. You know it." Bridget's mouth snapped. "Had the right to keep the family from ruin, Master Thomas." If the town knew her sentence finished on a snap that left the accusation hanging, the family had a danger they wanted to bury. 3 people on the landing, all of them quartered against an old hurt. Lady Evelyn refused to open the door. Thomas demanded the explanation. Bridget tried to protect. An early event shifted the shape of the evening. Thomas pushed past Lady Evelyn and pressed his ear to the door. The harp's phrase paused and then resumed softer, like a voice inhaling. Thomas stepped back and said, "We will not leave it shut while music speaks from inside. If you fear shame, Lady Evelyn, then we will hold the truth cleanly and answer it." His voice was steady with a decision and with the first fracture of a son's reverence. Lady Evelyn's eyes filled in a way that showed grief, not argument. "It cost us much. That is why I did it." Her explanation dropped into the corridor like a stone. Thomas shifted from anger toward a guilt he carried for not having been present in the days the house had judged itself. Suspicion softened into the need for facts. They searched the study and the servants' annex in pairs. Thomas opened drawers, lifted books, and knocked at the bottoms of crates. Bridget moved methodically, lifting scrap papers and spreading them on the long table. The study smelled of tobacco, varnish, and old glue. A scrap of torn sheet music lay under a candlestick in a heap of papers. The top stave showed a tight, nervy passage of runs and an inked flourish that matched the phrase Thomas had heard. Beside the music, half hidden under a portrait frame, a silver chain glinted. When Thomas picked at the frame's backing, he found a corner of a faded photograph and a small crease in the edge of the backing board where something had been removed. Thomas pulled the photograph free and found a woman's hair pinned inside the backing, a lock of golden hair pressed against the paper with a ribbon. He recognized the neatness of the hand that had cut and tied it. The lock had been placed with care. He lifted the scrap of sheet music until the lines matched the tune he'd heard. Bridget turned the portrait to find only a blank backing and a smudge of candle wax where a name might have been written. The study had given them 2 things, evidence of music practiced once and the clear act of erasure. In the corridor outside, Lady Evelyn stood with her hands folded. When Thomas confronted her, she did not deny that she had sealed the nursery after an accident. "Aisling was there when she fell," she said, voice small. She named a person that had not been spoken aloud for years. The name dropped like a new fact that changed what they thought they knew. She was only 24. Her hands found the harp strings, and then Lady Evelyn's composure failed. Her breathing hitched, and she covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Suspicion in Thomas turned to a different knot, guilt for what had been avoided, and a new urgency to see what lay behind the door. Thomas' anger snapped into rapid questions. Who else knows? How can Bridget say she hid a locket if she did not mean to? Why is the baby room kept like a tomb? He spoke the last word hard. Lady Evelyn looked at Bridget, and then at her son. "We kept it closed to keep the family's name whole. We made choices. We paid for discretion. There are letters and 1 unsent note. That is why I said no." Her hands made a motion as if smoothing a dress, and each smoothing was a mechanical refusal to allow herself to feel more. Bridget stepped forward then and set her iron key on the banister. She pulled the small lacquered mourning locket from under her apron and laid it flat so both Thomas and Lady Evelyn could see the pressed lock of hair inside. He moved the key once. "Master Thomas," she said, "he thought I did it for you. I thought if I put it away, the town would not speak. I didn't reckon on the music coming back. I thought the past would sleep if the door stayed bolted." Bridget's voice held both defiance and pleading. Her admission shifted the emotional current again. Suspicion gave way to a heavy regret that made the three of them feel the room as if it had weight. By midnight they had agreed to one course: find the missing key by searching the servants' rooms and the study thoroughly. If that failed, force the lock and look for human causes before any notion of haunting took hold. Thomas and Bridget moved to continue the search, while Lady Evelyn retreated to the great hall for a brief moment to steady herself. Their decisions were actions that showed the next emotional shift, from suspicion to determined inquiry. When Thomas and Bridget returned to the servants' annex, Bridget opened a trunk that had not been touched in years. Inside lay a folded practice dress and a small silver harp pendant on a thin chain. Thomas found a scrap of paper tucked between the folds with a line of music, and the words "Do not send" written across it in a hand Lady Evelyn would later say was Aisling's. The discovery tightened everything. Thomas realized they were no longer simply solving an oddity. They were uncovering a deliberate concealment of a person who had mattered. The mini cliffhanger arrived then, footsteps overhead, measured and slow, as if someone paced the nursery floor, and the faintest sound of fingers on strings. They froze. Bridget's jaw clenched. Thomas gripped the edge of the table and felt the wood press into his palm. The steps stopped. For a long count the house held its breath. Then a soft rustling followed, like paper shifting in an empty room. Thomas mouthed, "Do you hear that?" And Bridget nodded without sound. The next move was forced. They gathered tools: a fat iron bolt turner, a wedge, a candle, and returned to the landing where the nursery waited. Lady Evelyn stood with them now, face composed in the way of someone putting on a mask. "If you force the lock," she said quietly to Thomas, "you will find things I have tried to hide. Are you sure you wish this?" Her question was not only to Thomas, it was to herself. He met her eyes and said, "I am sure." "We owe Aisling more than silence." The words were small and naked. There was no melodramatic flourish, just the plain act, a son demanding truth for someone the family had put away. They forced the lock with a wedge and hammer. The bolt gave a high, metallic sigh and then slipped. The door swung open on hinges that had been oiled enough to remember motion. Candlelight fell into the nursery and revealed a room arranged as if a child might return: a small cradle, a music stand with an open score, a harp with a dust skin half draped over it. The harp had not been played recently. The strings were bright and unbroken. On the dressing table a lacquered mourning locket lay open beside an unsent letter. Thomas stooped and read the first line aloud. "Forgive me if this reaches you only in my hand." His voice shook. Lady Evelyn took a step back and pressed her hand to her throat. Her fingers found the jet brooch and left fingerprints in the dark polish. For the first time that night she let her knees bend and sat on the low stool by the cradle. "Forgive me," she whispered. And the movement of the word filled the room with the sound of a thing finally named. The emotional movement had shifted again. Grief asserted itself visibly. Thomas moved to the harp and ran a single finger along a string. The note was thin, the same interval he had first heard in the corridor. He lowered the candle until the flame trembled. Bridget opened the unsent letter with fingers that trembled. She read the name aloud: Aisling Burren, and then more lines that spoke plainly of fear, of love, of a girl who had been apprenticed to the house and then taken into the nursery because of a pregnancy. The letter told of a night when a child was lost and how the family had chosen a course that preserved respectability by silence. Thomas felt his anger and his suspicion give way to something else, a hollowed sorrow that made sure his hands would not tremble, but would move with Caramother. He said, voice low, "We cannot hide this any longer. We must answer what happened," and to whom his words were a choice that demanded action. Lady Evelyn let out a breath that sounded like an old clock's slow winding. She reached into her gown and drew out a small folded sheet with a neat curl of hair pressed inside the lacquered locket. She set it on the table beside the harp pendant. "Thought I was protecting us," she said in a voice that no longer tried to sound steady. She looked at Thomas and Bridget, as though counting who remain needy thought secrecy would keep us whole. I see now it made a tome. I cannot undo what was done, but I will not add silence to the harm her face, lined and composed earlier, now carried an open, human wariness. They sat in the nursery long after the lock had been forced. The harp stood ready and the candle burned lower, leaving pools of light. Thomas folded the unsent letter and slid it into his waistcoat pocket. Bridget took the locket and held it to her apron for a moment before slipping it back under her dress. She would be the keeper no longer. Outside, the cliff wind hit the manor with a steady percussion, and the sea sent a far, low boom that one could confuse with a sigh. For Thomas, the night's emotional arc had moved from suspicion to anger to grief and toward a new resolve. To let the harp's notes remain and to answer questions rather than bury them. Before they left the nursery, Lady Evelyn stood and smoothed her skirts with the practiced motion she used in public. Leave the door unbolted. She said, if anyone comes to listen, let them hear. We will face what they ask, and we will not pretend no one was harmed. Her voice contained both pain and a resolution that was not theatrical. It was a small, private pledge. Thomas placed his hand on the doorframe and felt the grain beneath his palm. He tested the latch and left it unlatched, allowing the room to breathe. Bridget closed the nursery door behind them but did not draw the bolt. Her fingers paused on the knob. She tapped the iron key at her waist against her thigh once, and then placed it in the provender chest in the servants' room with a deliberate motion. The final, concrete beat came as 3 soft knocks on the outer entrance hall door, someone arriving at the manor at dawn, and Thomas turned toward the sound, the unsent letter heavy in his pocket. The knock repeated, measured. Thomas stepped down the corridor with Bridget at his side and Lady Evelyn following more slowly. He opened the heavy front door and found the first thin light of morning and a figure on the path, cloak wet with sea spray. Bridget froze when a single harp note rang from the closed nursery, and the wooden peg, where the iron key always hung, was empty. Suspicion tightened her hands. She had wound the clocks and checked the pegs that evening, and the missing key meant someone had entered the preserved room. She bent and pressed her ear to the corridor skirting board, listening for another note, for any footfall, for an answer. The note came again, precise, deliberate, a pulled string that cut the corridor's hush and left the manor's stone to answer with its hollowing echo. Bridget straightened and moved faster than etiquette allowed. She crossed the upper gallery with a basket of linens clutched to her chest and did not slow until the nursery door filled her vision. The key peg was bare. She touched the peg and felt the grain of the wood under her fingertips and the small ring of rust where the key had hung. Her mouth went dry. She ran her free hand along the nursery's painted lintel, finding no forced splintering, no sign of violent entry. She chose action over conjecture. Bridget turned and ran down the servants' stairs. She had slept in the house since Thomas was a child. She knew the quickest way to the main hall. Her boots thudded on the back stairs, then on the kitchen landing. She did not stop to light any lamp. Thomas, she called, voice short. The name dragged across the hall. The portrait over the mantel seemed to watch her as she rushed past. Thomas answered from the hearth, rubbing at his eyes with one hand and holding his silver watch in the other. He rose quickly when he saw Bridget's face. Bridget. What's wrong? Nursery. Bridget the harp. The keys gone. Thomas, brow folded. He had only hours before halted on the servants' corridor because of a harp note. Bridget remembered the previous night's noise and how he had frozen there when the sound struck. He straightened. Show me. They moved toward Lady Evelyn's private parlor. The house seemed to notice their speed. The cook pushed to the side with an apologetic lift of sleeve, and the footman closed the inner door behind them with a soft, careful hand. On the way, Bridget's mind supplied details she had tried not to rehearse aloud: the harp's silver strings, the practice stool, Aisling's harp pendant. She clenched the basket until linen strained. They found Lady Eveline at the writing table, the lamp low, her gloved hands folded. She looked up with a small, measured motion that showed she had been expecting disruption of some sort. Thomas did not wait for explanation. Lady Eveline, he said, voice edged the nursery, someone has been in it. The peg is empty. We heard the harp tonight. Eveline's hand went to her brooch. She did not Rosettamus. She said, oh, not speak in that tone. Sit. Tell me plainly. Bridget put the linens down and spoke quickly, laying out the facts without flourish. The peg is empty. I heard a note from within. I checked the outer latch. I thought perhaps you thought perhaps what? Eveline, each word cut precise. Thomas moved, closing the small distance between them. Thought someone has forced the door. We need the key. Eveline's fingers tightened on the brooch until the red-black jet clicked. There is no key to be had. The key was fastened to the peg for decades. I told you all the story is to remain sealed. She placed the brooch between her fingers and tapped it twice. No one enters that room without cause. Bridget felt the change in the air, a shift from assumption to guarded refusal. This was the second emotion that rose since she heard the note. Urgency. She stepped closer. Lady Eveline, the harp played. I heard it. The house heard it. We must see the nursery. Eveline's gaze did not break. Thomas, you will know how this looks. The family name. Thomas cut in. Lady Eveline, the family name won't be protected by silence. If there are signs someone is in the house at night. His voice sharpened. He said her name again like a small challenge. Eveline inhaled and let the breath go with careful control. Bring Bridget's key. If you must. Thomas. Her refusal changed to concession in the same motion. That concession was small and significant. They did not argue further. Bridget offered the iron key at her waist on its braided cord. Thomas took it and checked the ring, then the bit, then the way it caught at the teeth. He glanced at Eveline and then at Bridget. At the nursery door. Thomas hesitated, palm on the handle. For a moment the sound of the storm over the cliff pressed through the house in a low, sifted rumble. Then he turned the key. The lock yielded with a soft, familiar drag. Inside, the nursery remained arranged in faithful preservation. The practice stool sat before the harp. The harp's polished soundboard showed the same small nick along its rim, where Aisling used to bump it with her wrist. Dust lay in the corners in thin, pale ribbons. At first glance nothing seemed disturbed. Then Bridget saw it, a single harp string, still faintly vibrating, the end caught in the instrument's frame and humming with residual sound. A tear lay along the scattered sheet music, a fresh rent in a page that otherwise had not been handled for years. Bridget's hand went to her mouth. Thomas moved to the bench and ran his fingers over the papers. There, he said, voice low, someone's been here. He looked up and then at the window. Rain had drawn lines down the glass. A smear of dried mud marked the sill, smudged in an uneven crescent, as if someone had pressed a boot there and left the mark. Bridget reached forward and touched the mud. Her fingers came away grey with Asling's handwriting. Thomas abruptly, folding the torn scrap so the curvature of the pen strokes was visible. This line, she practiced that phrase. I know her hand. Bridget stared at the scrap. The black ink curled in the familiar loops that she had watched Aisling write on countless mornings. The harp pendant Aisling had worn had vanished years before, when she disappeared. Now, here, in a room sealed for decades, a scrap of her practice remained, and fresh mud on the sill proved someone had stood at that window recently. Eveline had rejoined them at the doorway, hands clasped. She looked older than her 52 years in the lamplight. Bridget watched the thin scar along Eveline's cheekbones. Eveline's chin lifted in a brittle, controlling motion. You brought me trouble, Bridget. Eveline. Her voice was tight but steady. Bridget answered with what she had. I brought the truth. Eveline's eyes flashed truth. Thomas, do you understand what this will invite? Visitors, gossip, claims on the estate. We swore to keep the past closed, and if the past is walking the corridor at night, Thomas. He the words plainly. We cannot lock it away and pretend it will not knock. Eveline's hand shook once. and she set her mourning locket on a small side table rather than returning it to her throat. Bridget saw the pressed lock of hair inside the locket through the dented silver lid when Evelyn shifted it. The gesture was small, but Bridget read it as a concession greater than any spoken permission. Bridget's suspicion had turned into urgency. Then Thomas' practical anger widened the danger into accusation. Now the room demanded action. Thomas stepped to the harp and lifted the pendant. From where it lay under the bench, a small silver chain curled like a captured insect. He held it up. "It's Aisling's pendant," he said. "Where did this fall?" "I do not know, Evelyn." Her lids lowered. "It was not in this house for years." A sharp sound sliced the space. An actual, continued phrase on the harp. The instrument moved from a single note into a wrenching series that rose and fell as if someone were playing to itself. The three of them turned toward the window at once. Under the window sill, Thomas found a folded scrap tucked in the seam of the bench. He unfolded it with 2 fingers, and Bridget saw practice marks and a short phrase in the same hand that bent into the medieval flourish she knew. Mud specks smudged the corner. Thomas' jaw tightened. Before any of them could speak, the nursery's upper sash opened with a whisper of rope, and a pale figure moved in the rain like a shape in a frame. The figure did not immediately speak. For a breath Bridget only watched the thin movement of fabric. Then the shape stepped fully into the room, tall enough to be Aisling if she had not been gone so long. Aisling's hair hung wet and loose. Her coat was clinging to her shoulders from the rain. Bridget's hands went cold and then hot at once. Evelyn cried out, a sound less measured than usual. Aisling. The name tore past the parlor's etiquette and landed raw. The figure paused and then reached toward the harp. Fingers hovered over the strings in the exact posture Bridget had seen in the young woman's hands when she taught herself tunes by candlelight. Bridget watched the fingers hesitate and then pluck the same phrase they had heard a moment before. Thomas stepped forward. Aisling, speak to us. Who are you? He did not hold his temper now. There came no answer at first. The woman, if she was Aisling, tilted her head, listening as if the house itself had a voice. Then she spoke in a voice that carried a salt and jasmine timbre, quiet and distant. He had to come back. Bridget kept watching for signs she could name. The set of Aisling's shoulders, the pale grey-blue of her eyes, the small music stain on her inner wrist that glittered faintly when she lifted her hand. All matched. Evelyn's composure broke. She crossed the nursery's floor in 3 strides. Aisling, you had no right to return. She grabbed at the harp's stand and nearly toppled it with the force of her hand. Bridget flinched as the instrument rocked. Lady Evelyn, stop, she said. Evelyn turned on Bridget with a tight laughter. Not speak to me of rights. You were the one to find the peg empty. You brought strangers into my house. I brought only what I heard. Bridget. Her words came quicker now. The note woke me. I followed it. I told Thomas. We came. Aisling let her gaze slide from Evelyn to Thomas to Bridget. Her fingers found the harp again and dragged a note low, near the instrument's belly. The tone vibrated through the soles of their feet. Her voice was steady but thin. "Thee will not let me finish. Who will not?" Thomas demanded. Bridget watched him step closer, hands open to show he meant no violence. Aisling did not answer directly. Instead she lifted the pendant, cold in her palm, and showed it. Rain spattered the bead of silver. This fell when I left. I thought it lost. I returned to find it. Bridget watched the pendant and felt a sudden, sharp realignment, a twist that made earlier assumptions look narrower. This was the twist that shifted their understanding of the turmoil in the house. If Aisling had returned of her own will, then someone else in the house had arranged for the harp to be heard and for the nursery to be entered. Someone had forced the family to reveal its secret. Evelyn's mouth tightened. If you left, why did you not send word? Her tone held accusation. Aisling's eyes glanced at the locket on the side tablet. Because I could not trust the letter to arrive. I could not trust anyone to deliver the name. Bridget felt unease prick behind her ribs. She stepped forward with deliberate calm. Thomas, look at the mud. It is fresh. Someone stood at this sill only hours ago. He knelt and touched the smudge again, then looked up. Then, even if she came alone, someone else has been in the house tonight. Bridget's suspicion collapsed into a brighter, more immediate fear. The fear moved her body. She began to pace the small space between harp and window, as if searching the air for more hints. She ran a hand over the harp's rim and felt a new tack of salt and a smear of rain. Her breathing increased. Evelyn crossed her arms and watched them. Will not invite the neighbors. We will not take this to public eyes. We manage this ourselves. Thomas' reply was quick. Lady Evelyn, you cannot manage what you do not know. We must learn who entered and why Aisling has returned in secret. That exchange opened a new current of conflict. Bridget could see both sides, Evelyn's attempt to preserve reputation and Thomas' push for answers. Bridget's own choice sat between them: protect the household's quiet or push for the truth that might sunder it. She found the answer in action, rather than words. Than start with the window. She said whoever came climbed this way or was brought here. Check for rope, footprints, anything outside the sill. Thomas fetched the lanthorn. Lady Evelyn, give me permission to question the staff. Evelyn held the locket and turned it once in her fingers, then placed it on the harp bench before she answered. The motion was small and deliberate. It changed the room more than a speech might do. As you must, she said, but be discreet. Thomas grabbed the lanthorn and dashed up the servants' stairs. Bridget stayed with Evelyn and Aisling. She the questions that would reveal character. Aisling, she said, keeping her voice plain. Way return now. Who would force the harp to play? Aisling's gaze rested on the pendant. He could not finish the piece. I woke some nights and dreamed the second phrase. I thought, if I come back and lay the music down, perhaps the rest will be heard. Bridget sank into the small stool and watched the way Aisling folded her hands. The woman's fingers mimicked plucking strings even when still. Bridget could not tell if the action was habit or compulsion. Footsteps on the stair announced Thomas' return with the lanthorn, and a moment later he stood at the sill, lantern light painting the wet stone outside. He leaned out the window, inspecting the narrow ledges and the ivy that crawled down toward the cliff. There are wet boot prints. He said they lead along the ledge, but not down. Someone stood there and then left toward the west path. He chewed his lip. He will check the grounds. Bridget, speak with the staff. Then meet me in the kitchen. We will question quietly. Bridget nodded and rose. She felt the chapter's tension pull taut. Suspicion had given way to urgency, then to accusation, then to the shock of Aisling's presence, and now to a grim determination. She moved to the gallery and called for the housekeeper. In the kitchens Bridget found Bridget O'Connell's familiar station. No, that is not right. She found Mrs. O'Connell at the spit, with flour powdered along her apron and a kettle steaming on the hob. Bridget's fingers clicked against a ladle. Her voice was businesslike. Bridget, she said, using the housekeeper's name, we need the staff in the scullery in 5 minutes. Tell Tom and Mary to come with dry clothes. Lock the back door and do not speak to anyone about the nursery. Bridget O'Connell, her name again. Though the housekeeper usually took the simple, Bridget gave a small, sharp nod and clicked her tongue the way she did when she was anxious. I'll fetch them, miss. I'll fetch them quick as a hare. Back in the nursery, Evelyn paced once and then sat, briefly resting a hand on the harp's soundboard as if to steady herself. Aisling watched her with a faint tilt of head. He left because I feared my presence would harm you all. Aisling thought silence was safer. But I cannot keep the piece unfinished any longer. Evelyn's reply was rawer than polite. You abandoned us. You left without word. We buried the scandal you left behind. We kept the house closed to survive. Aisling's fingers tightened on the pendant. He did not choose to leave that night. I was taken. I escaped when I could. I hid at the cliffs until I could make my way back. I had no paper. I had no friend to trust with a letter. For a moment Evelyn's composure cracked. She stood and crossed the room, then stopped to hold herself in place. The silence that followed contained more than any speech. Bridget watched Evelyn breathe and move her gloved fingers to smear a speck of dust from the harp's ledge out of an old reflex. Thomas returned from the grounds with mud stiff behind his boots. He carried the lanthorn and a length of rope. Someone used the west path. He reportedly did not come down the cliff, but they left prints near the old gate and a scrap of cloth caught in the hawthorn. That discovery led to another shift, suspicion to clarity. Bridget realized the intruder might be local and intentional. She had been prepared to suspect a wandering tramp. Now the signs suggested a planned approach and knowledge of the Manor's hidden turns. The next hours moved in tight beats, questioning the cook, who had been in the kitchen all evening and heard nothing but a distant bell. Questioning the footman, who swore he had not left his post. Checking the hawthorn where the scrap of cloth hung like a pale tongue. Each discovery pushed the household toward a new resolve. At last, Thomas and Bridget returned to the nursery to find Evelyn sitting upright with the locket in her hand and Aisling at the harp. The woman lifted her fingers and plucked a single low chord. The sound filled the room and then settled. I will not make a spectacle of this. Evelyn, speaking to both of them, but I will not close my eyes to what stands before me now. Leave the door open while we decide what to do. Thomas, you will fetch a notebook. Bridget, see that the staff do not speak about tonight. Aisling, stay where we can see you. Aisling nodded. Her hands rested on her knees. She did not smile. Bridget saw the faint music stain on the wrist and the way her fingers twitched in mimicry of plucking. The house settled into a slow alignment of choices. Thomas took a pen and began to write inventory, names, questions. Bridget moved like a hinge between people, tasks, errands, small comforts. Evelyn took the locket and unfastened the pin from her throat. She did not put the brooch on. She left it on the table. The gesture signaled something, and Bridget felt it, a concession to action over preservation. Before the chapter closed, there was a final, small reveal. Bridget bent to pick up a fallen scrap under the harp bench and found a short sentence in Aisling's hand that named a place along the west path and a time. Thomas read it aloud. Meet me at the hawthorn. Midnight. The line was plain signed, and the words clenched the moment. Someone had planned the meeting. Someone had tempted the house's sleep. Someone had put the pendant where it could be found. Bridget looked at Evelyn. You must go to the hawthorn at midnight, she said. Evelyn closed her eyes for an instant and then opened them with decision. We will go. But we go together. They extinguished the lanthorn and left the nursery door ajar, the harp's silvery ring echoing once more before it quieted. Outside, rain washed the path and the cliff line like a hand wiping a surface clean, but leaving the rough gouge of footprints behind. Bridget felt the night's motion settling into a plan. The house would no longer hide its wounds. As they moved down the gallery, Evelyn placed the mourning locket on the harp bench, where everyone could see it. The gesture was small and terrible, a token left on the instrument that had been silenced for years. It declared a new course. Bridget kept her fingers close to the braided cord at her waist. The key peg was empty, no longer in their minds. The peg had been hollowed by absence, and then filled by the return of truth. They left the nursery door half closed and moved toward the main stairs with a new, grim intent. The last sound in the room was a single quiet note, drawn as if in farewell or summons. Bridget heard it as both. The note closed the chapter's small conflict. The locked room had been entered, the harp had played again, and the family must now pursue the person who arranged that return. The hour of the hawthorn loomed, and with it a choice none of them could avoid. A single, high harp note cut the dining hall conversation in half, and Thomas knocked the rim of his plate with his palm. Suspicion tightened Thomas' chest the way a rope tightens around driftwood. He pushed his chair back and stood. The servants froze, forks midway to lips, and Lady Evelyn's hand halted at her teacup. The problem was now public. Music from the locked nursery had invaded the family supper, and the household could no longer pretend the sound belonged to wind or memory. Thomas moved before a thought finished. He set the plate upright and said, "The nursery." His voice carried over the table. The name landed like a concrete fact. Lady Evelyn's jaw closed. Bridget reached for the back of her chair with one hand and, with the other, smoothed the apron that always hid the iron key at her waist. The suspicion that had simmered beneath polite restraint in previous nights became action now. They would follow the sound. They left the table battered by silence. Thomas led, shoes thudding on the polished boards, every step a question. In the servants' landing he glanced at the wooden peg where the iron key was kept and saw the peg empty again. Bridget's fingers found the cold wood and checked the peg without fidgeting. She had done this before, and her brows narrowed. "The peg is empty. She said it was full when I set the clocks." "Mr. Thomas," her voice curved into accusation by habit. The missing peg reopened the wound the household had tried to seal. Bridget's hands were steady, but her mouth pressed into a thin line. Thomas felt the old anger flare, part guilt and part resolve. He, who else knows its place? The question demanded an answer that would name motive and opportunity. Lady Evelyn stayed on the stair, one gloved hand against the balustrade. She did not answer at once. Instead, she watched Thomas the way a captain watches the sea when a reef is near. They tried the nursery door. Thomas pushed. It resisted. He shouldered the frame, palms flat against varnished wood, and the lock gave with a reluctance that sounded like something surrendering. Candlelight slanted across the threshold as they stepped in. The harp remained where it had always been, near the south window, its strings unbowed and its polished soundboard bright enough to catch the candle flames. Yet a single page of sheet music lay turned over on the bench, a small silver pendant on the floor. Bridget stooped and picked up the pendant with fingers that smelled faintly of boiled tea and peat. She held the chain like proof this wasn't here before, she said. Her voice did not rise, it presented fact. Thomas crouched and read the turned page, an unfamiliar rehearsal phrase, the ink not smudged but not entirely dry either. The presence of a turned page implied recent hands. That changed what Thomas felt from suspicion to a rigid, hot anger. Someone had entered the sealed room and touched what they had no right to touch. Evelyn, Thomas demanded. Voice loaded you. He let the sentence hang, unfinished by courtesy and completed by accusation. Lady Evelyn's hands folded at her throat, fingers worrying the jet brooch, until the metal pressed a crescent mark into her skin. Thomas. She said he have not set foot in the nursery since she stopped, and replaced the unsaid with grief that showed as a tightened mouth and a slight shake of the shoulders. The room took her silence as a presence of its own. Bridget slid a folded scrap from beneath the harp bench and flattened it on her knee. The scrap bore a name and a date, Aisling Byrne, and a year that contradicted the official record the family had kept in its ledger. Thomas stared at the handwriting, slanted, careful, then looked up at Evelyn. The paper shifted the direction of their questions. Suspicion widened into doubt. Who had the right to visit Aisling, and who had lied about it for the sake of reputation? Aisling Byrne, Thomas repeated. The name had weight. In the house it belonged to a girl whose presence had become rumor and half-whispered pity. Lady Evelyn's face tightened, but her voice returned to a practiced calm. She was only a pupil. She said she lived with us briefly and then left. We closed that part of the house because of what would have followed. We meant to protect her memory. Thomas, her hands trembled just enough to make the brooch click. The conversation fractured into short exchanges. Thomas wanted answers. Bridget wanted the household safe. Evelyn wanted preservation of a past that did not shame her public name. Words pushed at one another across the nursery like cold fingers. Thomas, we cannot keep saying memory and call it enough. He named what the scrap forced them to confront. Someone had crossed the family's rules. Bridget put the pendant into her palm and turned it so the tiny harp face caught the candle. This was her locket, Miss Evelyn. I remember seeing it once on the dresser. When she practiced here, her eyes cut toward the harp, then back to Evelyn. The housekeeper's voice hardened. Someone came in and touched Aisling's things. The accusation landed on the air with a physical thud. They widened the search. Thomas moved to the nursery shelves and pulled at the ledgers where music books were kept. He found nothing else out of place, only the turned page and a hairline scratch on the inside of the harp case, as if it had been opened and closed carelessly. He felt his anger shift again into a precise urgency. There were records to check, names to list, and someone to find. We searched the papers tonight. Start with the visitors list, and the lending ledger. The command was compact and carried the authority of a man who felt the house slipping from his control. Evelyn led them to her small study and let them rummage through the estate accounts. Her hands hovered often over a particular folio, but never opened it at first. Thomas thumbed through dates, signatures, and entries that catalogued the comings and goings of the manor. Bridget watched the mantel clock and clicked her tongue when the minute hand moved. The household's ledger told of tradesmen and deliveries, of seed orders and coal bills. Everything ordinary and legal were there, but the ledger did not account for the turned page nor the silver pendant. As they worked, Thomas' suspicion moved into a quieter fear that their attempts to protect reputation had hidden a more dangerous truth. He found a line item for an expense labeled pupil music supplies with no name attached for the year in question. Thomas read the numbers aloud. There's an entry here. Without a name, his voice held the search in it. Evelyn's hand brushed away a blot of soot on the margin, and she closed the folio with a little snap. Her lips formed words that shortened into restraint. Who made mistakes? Thomas. We paid for lessons for some pupils without recording their names, because we wished to avoid comment. She did not say who made the wish. The revelation shifted the room. Doubt became anger in the household staff. Bridget's lips pursed until the freckles near her nose disappeared. So someone paid for Aisling, and then unmade the paper trail. She said, who benefits from a missing name? The question refused to float in abstractions. It sought a person. Thomas, we should ask those who came recently. Start with Mr. Gray and the visiting clergy. Begin with those who had keys in the last year. His plans were action, a method to turn suspicion into fact. They left the study and paused on the landing. The nursery door stood behind them, and the harp's shadow still lay across the threshold. Bridget clicked her tongue and took a step closer to Evelyn. Miss Evelyn, she said in a voice that cut loose the formalities. If someone kept Aisling's music secret, then someone kept her visits secret. We mustn't bury it again. Her tone contained a fierce protection, the kind only a servant with long service affords. Thomas' anger threaded into urgency and then into a reluctant compromise. We will not bury it again. We will look through the incoming guest list, the ledger pages, and every receipt. Tomorrow at first light we unseal the nursery properly and let the instruments be seen. Evelyn's answer was small. Careful, we'll do it by dawn. Her fingers tightened on the railing until the knuckles paled. They returned to the nursery together, and Thomas hesitated at the threshold. He watched Bridget kneel and run a fingertip across the floorboards where the pendant had rested. He noticed details, the way the candle wax pooled at the base of the candlestick, the indent in the bench cushion, where a knee might have pressed. Those concrete signs replaced speculation with possible stories. The atmosphere tightened into pressure that thrummed at the temple. Thomas felt it as a physical strain behind his eyes. At the center of the room, before any word was fully spoken, a string vibrated. It made a single, thin sound like the cautious answer of a locked thing. The three of them startled. Lady Evelyn flinched, and Bridget swore under her breath. Thomas stepped forward until he nearly touched the harp. The string rang a small fragment of melody that matched the turned sheet's rhythm, and then fell silent as if someone had drawn a breath away. The event transformed their fear into something more immediate. The possibility that Aisling's presence was not only written in paper, but in the air itself. Aisling's name came out of Thomas' mouth in a different tone, now less accusation, more a demand for closure Easling, he said. The name hung between them. There was no answer other than the candle's sputter. Bridget's hand went to the rosary beneath her apron, as if to anchor herself. Eveline's eyes glistened, but she did not look away from the harp. She left a piece unfinished. Eveline slowly thought silence would finish it for her. The line exposed a past choice. Their effort to preserve the family's name had become an enforced quiet on a girl's work. Thomas remembered the corridor where he had halted earlier in the week. The corridor from the first time the note had been heard. He thought of the way the servant's footsteps had fallen still in his memory. That earlier event was no longer an isolated oddity, but part of a pattern. We owe her the chance to have it finished, or at least to know who stopped her. We will not hide it because we are ashamed. The decision read as an action, not a speech. It moved the household toward repair. They argued in short bursts as they made arrangements. Who must not tell the neighbors yet. Even if they will turn it into gossip, we cannot pretend it did not happen either. Thomas replied, if we delay, we lose evidence. Bridget added, I will fetch the account books and the visiting list. I will speak to the stable boy and Mrs. Hargreave. They were here yesterday. The rapid exchange contained 3 quick turns, worry, practicality, and a plan. Outside the nursery window the sea pulled at itself. The wind struck the panes with a wet slap that made them all look up. For a moment the house felt smaller and full of listeners. The sound reminded them there were people beyond the manor who might react in ways that would harm Aisling's name and their own. Thomas felt resolve settle into him. Suspicion had become investigation and then responsibility. We begin at once. Bridget, you take the accounts and the visiting list. Eveline, you search your private folio. I will speak to the men at dawn and see who had unsanctioned keys. The plan was practical and immediate. Bridget left with the pendant tucked into her palm and the ledger under her arm. Eveline lingered at the doorway and then followed. Thomas stayed for a single breath longer and ran a hand along the harp's rim. The wood was cool and smelled faintly of varnish and salt. He whispered, not to anyone, but as an act of direction, if you are here, Usling, let the next note fall into truth. The whisper was neither plea nor command. It was a small promise that the house had been given a task to perform. By the time they reached the study, an outside knock came at the front door. 3 firm rappels that cut through the planning. A new arrival at this hour meant questions and compounded risk. Thomas moved toward the door with the ledger still under his arm. He opened it to find Mur, grey damp from the road, with a hat in hand and a look that shifted between apology and curiosity. Thomas, grey plainly, I meant no intrusion. I came about the west gate and I heard by chance a note as I rode past. I thought it might have been the sea. I did not mean to alarm you. His sentences were short and direct. Thomas looked at Grey and felt the suspicion tilt toward a new axis. Whether Grey's presence was innocent or part of a thread that led to someone who used the estate's shadowed rules for their own ends. Thomas answered with a question, not an accusation. Did you, or anyone with you, have a key to the nursery in the last fortnight? The challenge pressed for fact. Grey shook his head. No, sir. Only the gardener and the stable hand had keys, and they are accounted for. I speak only of the road. I came because I saw light. The answer opened a fresh path for inquiry without closing the old ones. They sent Grey away with a request to remain reachable and a clear instruction not to speak of what he had seen. The door shut on his damp coat. In the study, Evelyn finally opened the folio she had shielded from them. Inside were notes written in 2 different hands, one careful, official, another cramped and private. Among the cramped notes, Thomas found a ledger entry struck through, and a name erased with a knife. The physical act of scraping a name away made the house's secrets literal and violent. Thomas' anger changed shape. It sharpened into determination to read what had been erased. He took a small knife from Eveline's writing drawer and traced the shallow scrape where the name had been removed. The scraping revealed a hint of ink. He called Bridget back and asked her to hold a lamp at a low angle. The names showed up like ghost letters when the light scashed across the paper. They read Aisling Byrne with an amount paid by M.M. The initials reframed guilt into direction. Who at the manor used those initials, and why had they tried to hide them? Bridget's voice picked the thread. M. Could be Miss Moore, she said. Miss Evelyn's own hand is E.M. usually. Mem could be someone else in this house. We must be precise. Her suggestion forced them to look at the roster of names differently. Thomas, we will ask those who sign with initials and those who never sign at all. No one is above the ledger now. The sentence was compact, marking a change from suspicion to systematic interrogation. Night deepened. The house settled into a sharper alertness where every creak might be a footstep. Thomas found that his initial suspicion had moved through anger and fear and now turned into steady resolve to uncover who had touched Aisling's harp, who had erased her name, and why the household had protected silence. They arranged watch schedules for the night and decided to unseal the nursery at dawn with witnesses present. Just before they dispersed, a small, soft sound came from the nursery again. Not a full chord this time, but 3 notes too close, one distant, played on a single string. The sound was neither hostile nor comforting. It was insistence. The 3 of them, Thomas, Bridget, and Evelyn, stood in the corridor and listened until their ears stopped counting the seconds. The notes left them with a fragile aftereffect, a promise of more to come and a necessity to keep moving. Thomas closed the study door with both hands and set the folio on the desk. We begin in daylight. We take records, we ask questions, and we do not let the house conceal another name. Evelyn's reply was a small nod, and Bridget clicked her tongue in agreement. They left the room with plans and a new urgency. The final sound of the chapter came not in words, but in a single physical act. Bridget placed the silver pendant on the mantel beside the ledger, a token turned from evidence into an appointment marker. Outside, the wind hit the manor with a last bracing gust. The night swallowed it, and the house settled into the pacing they had set: search, question, and an opening at dawn. The chapter closed on a concrete beat, Bridget's hand lingering on the pendant, as if sealing a promise that the house would not hide this music again, and the household moving into action that would reveal who had kept Aisling's name erased. Emotion root, suspicion led Thomas from a broken meal to a plan of inquiry. Emotion shifts, suspicion, anger, fear, resolve. The night left them with tasks and a single need: find who touched the harp and who erased the name, and prepare the nursery to answer when dawn came. A heavy portrait crashed from its peg. The frame struck the marble, and a folded letter slid free across the floor. Suspicion tightened Thomas' chest the way a gloved hand might grip a sleeve, because the sound came during the same gale that had already given him reason to watch the house. He stooped, the hem of his coat brushing the fallen canvas, and saw the first line: Aisling Byrne promised to meet, and a place named in the margin. The discovery forced a clear problem forward. Someone in Moonfall Manor had kept a secret that connected the harp in the locked nursery to a person whose name should have been spoken only in mourning. Thomas pulled the letter free with fingers that trembled not from cold but from the speed of his thinking. Suspicion shaped every choice he made that night. He did not wait for ceremony. Thomas stepped back into the gallery and called, "Mother." He kept his voice flat. Lady Evelyn Moore stood beneath the west window in her dark gown, one hand at her throat where the jet brooch rested. She crossed the room with small, precise steps. "What is it, Thomas?" she asked. He showed her the exposed edges of paper before he opened the sheet, because the sliver of white on the floor had a gravity of its own. The gale bangs the shutters as he unfolded the letter. The first lines read like a plan: a time, a boat, Aisling's name. Thomas' eyes snagged on another line written in a hurried hand that hinted at shame and a promise to leave. He read aloud: "If my name must be said, say only that I went to find a place where music will not be hushed." He stopped and looked to Lady Evelyn. She pinched the bridge of her nose and folded herself smaller in the tall room. Memories returned in concrete scraps that Thomas could name. Earlier that week he had halted on the servants' corridor when a single, clear harp note cut the late evening hush and settled against the stone walls. In the day before, the wooden peg where the iron key always hung had been empty, and Bridget had paused with her hand on the clock, an empty peg that meant someone had entered a room carefully preserved. Tonight the portrait had fallen of its own motion, but someone had placed the letter there first. That fact made the problem worse. Evidence had been hidden just to be revealed. Lady Evelyn took the letter with fingers that did not tremble. She read the name and then looked out at the cliff as if searching the dark water for an answer. Thomas, she said quietly, who wrote this? Her voice had the measured cadence she used when speaking to parish officials. Thomas saw the small pale scar along her cheek tighten. He felt impatience rise like a sudden tide. It names Aisling and a place for leaving. It suggests she was to elope. It suggests there was a man. Evelyn's lips tightened. She smoothed her skirt with both hands, the habitual motion that steadied her when words would fail. Aisling was loved by the household. She said she was a girl who had place and practice. She had no bad intent. Before Thomas could answer, a figure struck the gallery doorway like a sharp note. Bridget O'Connell arrived with her iron key on a cord at her waist, the braided cord swinging as she came in. Her face was set with astonishment Thomas had seen when she caught a lie from a servant. She clicked her tongue once, then stopped, eyes on the letter, and then on Evelyn. Bridget, Thomas, did you hang that portrait? Bridget's jaw worked. Did not, Master Thomas. She placed both palms flat on the rail, as if steadying herself against wind. But I know that peg. If the key's been taken off it, then it's been taken. I hid the spare once. For a reason. Thomas moved closer. You hid a key. Bridget's green eyes fixed on his. He hid a key the year Aisling's father fell ill. I took a key and I moved a frame. I did it because her voice broke and she swallowed. She took a breath, then forced the sentence out because some things would have ruined a girl more than a runaway. Thomas felt anger flare. You took the key to protect her, he demanded. Bridget tapped the braided cord and looked to Evelyn. Moved that child's portrait because she would have been mocked in town. I hid a way out because the wrong gossip would have done her harm. Lady Evelyn. I did not think it would be used to hide theft. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. Bridget, why would you keep the key hidden without telling me? The housekeeper let out a breath like a wound closing. He told you after, when it mattered less, she said, but not that night. I thought I was keeping an honor. The room contracted around guilt and accusation. Thomas' voice was flat. You put us in the dark. Aisling's music stopped because of what was done in this house. If you hid the means to look inside, you hid evidence too. Bridget's lip trembled. Did what I thought right. I am not the one to blame for what followed. They argued in short lines, the three of them trading question and answer like blows. Thomas spoke faster, saying Lady Evelyn's name often, so there could be no confusion in the hearing. He forced the issue forward, the letter on the floor, the empty peg, the harp notes that had intruded into the hall on 3 separate nights. Each piece assembled a charge. The argument ended with a decision made by movement rather than words. Thomas took the iron key from Bridget's cord. Then show me where the nursery door sits, he said. He fit the key into the lock with a hand that did not quite stop shaking. They moved as a single, blunt thing through the house. The lantern light cut the dark of corridors into sharp bands. Thomas kept his hand on the pendant that he had never claimed before, though he had seen Aisling moving near the hearth months earlier. The corridor led them to the preserved nursery. The door had been oiled and painted, but the iron lock turned with a small, satisfying click that felt louder than the storm outside. Thomas pushed the door. The room smelled of old wood and the faint residue of beeswax. The harp stood against the western wall, strings like pale wires catching the low lantern glow. Dust lay in the corners. On the windowsill there were narrow, wet marks, damp footprints pressed into the inside ledge, as if someone had mounted the sill and leaned out. Thomas touched one print. The salt on his fingers told him the steps were fresh enough to be noticed. He ran a thumb along the lower strings. One string felt recently tightened. The wire hummed with a note that had not yet settled. He pulled the string with his finger and heard a single high tone that stopped every thought in his head. At that sound the nursery breathed another life. Thomas lifted his hand and found, near the hearth, a small silver harp pendant half buried beneath a scrap of scorched music. He slid it free. It lay against his palm warmer than the metal ought to have been. He nothing, because the pendant's heat suggested either a human presence very recent or a body warm in memory. Bridget reached across the hearth its aislings. She said he have seen that Chain Thomas folded the pendant into his palm and felt the weight of a decision. He did not yet know where the weight would carry him, but he knew he would not leave it where he found it. He put it into his pocket, near the pocket watch that had belonged to his father. The motion felt like a promise. Thunder hit the cliff hard enough to rattle the nursery glass. In the hallway behind them someone moved footsteps on the stair that were not theirs. Thomas opened the door a fraction and peered out. The landing was empty, but a lamp guttered on the sideboard. A sheet of paper lay half slid beneath 1/4 of an inch of wood, where a portrait had lain earlier. He bent and picked up the paper. It was not a letter this time, but a scrap of composition, the measure lines torn and the musical notation ragged as if the hand that wrote it had been interrupted. They returned to the gallery and pried at the portrait's frame. The wood had been cleverly hollowed at the back. When they forced it open, a folded confession slid free and landed on the floor at Evelyn's feet. The naming in that confession hit like a physical blow. It placed blame on her late husband and described an action that had ruined Aisling's prospects. The confession said, in plain sentences, that the husband had used his position to promise things he did not intend to keep. It accused him of cruelty that had no right to be wrapped in an explanation. A silence followed, taut and audible. The gallery seemed to hold its breath with them. Thomas felt a new emotion mount, anger sharpened by betrayal. It names him. It names Father. Evelyn kept her face composed until a single syllable broke from Hermie husband. She began. And then she stopped because she could not make the sentence shape itself into defense or denial. She smoothed her brooch with 2 practiced fingers and then dropped her hand. Her mouth closed in a hardness Thomas had not seen in her before. Bridget took a step forward. Lady Evelyn, you knew? She asked, and her voice carried the low rasp of peat smoke. Her question landed like a tool. It forced an answer. Evelyn's shoulder moved in something like a shrewdie knew enough to keep the household from scandal. Bridget. I did what a matriarch should do. Thomas felt the words as a challenge. What you did silenced Aisling. You moved the blame into silence. The argument that followed was rapid and jagged. Bridget, you let him pass consequences to protect his name. You let the child be forgotten. Evelyn countered. You hid the key and you let a secret grow. You chose who to protect. Thomas leaned between them. Stop. Lady Evelyn, Bridget, listen. The point is that this house has kept a lie. Aisling's music did not stop because she wished it. It stopped because we shut a door. We have the letter. We have the pendant. We have a confession that names him. We must find proof beyond a folded paper. For a dozen heartbeats, there was only the storm and the small rustle of paper. Then Bridget crumpled onto a chair, fingers working the braid at her waist. He lied for kindness. She said he thought I was sparing her from shame. I am not excused. I am not proud. That admission moved the room into a different timbre. Thomas' anger cooled into a hard determination. He set his jaw. Then help me find the truth. He said, help me finish what Aisling could not. Evelyn's mouth tightened. Thomas, if we take this outside the house, what will happen to the name? What will happen to the estate? Thomas looked at his mother and then at Bridget. He remembered the late harp notes cutting the dining hall. He remembered the sting of food halted midair when the high note struck. He remembered the way everyone had looked at him when the music first intruded. Mother, I will protect the house. But I will not protect a lie that took a girl's life. I will find the proof Evelyn's hand touched the brooch and then left it. Her eyes filled for a moment, controlled and measured but clear. Then we must be careful. We must be discreet. Thomas pocketed the pendant again and felt its warmth through the cloth. He tested his decision by moving. He picked up the torn composition and laid it on the table. The music, even incomplete, had a phrase that suggested Aisling's voice, a rising figure at the end of a bar that did not resolve. Thomas hummed the phrase softly to himself, and the sound made his throat tight. They agreed to search records and to question a few old servants who still remembered the late husband with candor. Bridget promised to help him map the times when doors had been opened and portraits moved. Evelyn consented to a private reading of the confession with a solicitor in town if necessary. The plan formed in small pragmatic steps rather than speeches. Thomas felt the pull of two opposing needs, the need for justice for Aisling and the need to preserve the household he would one day inherit. As they spoke, a single, high harp note sounded clear and deliberate, cutting through the house from somewhere above them. The sound stopped each voice and made their skin prickle. Thomas looked upward. The locked nursery lay behind them. The note had the same exact pitch he had heard before. It landed like a question. Bridget clicked her tongue. Whoever played that string was here less than an hour ago. Master Thomas moved to the stair and listened. The house furnaces thudded. The wind tore at the outer shutters. He heard nothing else. He took a step back toward the gallery and found Lady Evelyn watching him with a face that had the pale flatness of someone receiving bad news. We gather what we can. We will not tell the servants until we know more. They spent the rest of the night cataloguing what they had. The letter found behind a portrait. Bridget's confession about a hidden key, damp footprints at the nursery window, the warmed pendant from Aisling's chain, the torn composition, and the folded confession that named his father. Each item tightened the case while also complicating loyalties. Before dawn, Thomas stood on the gallery landing overlooking the cliff and the ocean that hammered the rocks beneath. The pendant lay heavy in his palm. He turned it over and saw the tiny engraved harp. His hands were steady now. I will finish her music. I will find proof. Lady Evelyn, his Namathemus, she said, very soft. Promise me you will be careful. He folded the pendant into his palm one last time, and then slid it into his pocket beside the worn silver watch. He did not speak a long vow. He walked to the front door to fetch the solicitor in town who still answered his name at odd hours. His foot hit the bottom stair when a sharp rap sounded at the outer door. 3 quick knocks, followed by a voice calling his name, plainly, Mr. Moore. Thomas froze at the step, the pendant warm against his thigh, the confession half folded on the gallery table, and the house full of things that might break it or make it whole. He opened the door. Bridget stepped from the kitchen corridor with a basin in one hand and stopped when the nursery door stood unlatched, and a single, clear harp note still trembled in the air. Suspicion tightened her fingers around the basin. She remembered that wooden peg, where the iron key always hung, had been empty the night the clocks were wound. Bridget set the basin down and pressed her palm flat against the door frame to steady herself. The note did not repeat. It was a single clean sound, and it made her chest ache with a guarded, watchful fear that she could not name aloud. She pushed the door the width of her fingers and peered into the room. Dust had been left deliberately undisturbed, the crib corner still draped with a linen shawl, the little rocking horse placed precisely to catch the light. One small thing was wrong: the harp stool was gone. Bridget's mouth went dry and she swallowed the kettle taste at the back of her throat. She moved forward on the cold floorboards, shoes quiet, and found a damp, bare footprint on the sill where no foot should have been. Bridget set her jaw and walked out of the nursery into the hall. She found Thomas in the servants' stairwell, standing halfway down with his hand on the banister, as if the house itself had given him Thomas Bridget. Using his name as an exact note of the nursery door, it's unlatched. The harp has sounded, her voice kept a steady, clipped quality. Suspicion drove her now into action rather than rumination. Thomas' face closed into a hard line. He dropped the banister and moved faster than his height promised. "Show me, Thomas." He took 2 steps at once and Bridget matched his pace. On the landing, she did not try to soften what she had seen. She held the damp print like evidence. "See, the peg where the iron key hangs was empty the other night. Bridgetti, remember it, Thomas." "The key's not there now either." Thomas glanced up at the row of pegs and then back at the sill, as if a physical fact might slide free if he stared hard enough. They forced the nursery door wide. A draught breathed through the room, carrying with it the faint salt of the sea from the cliff. The harp stool's absence left an exact, round scuff in the floor. A silver pendant had been taken from its drawer, no chain, no clasp, only a thin smear where it had lain. Dust on the music stand bore a faint handprint pressed as if someone had leaned there to read a page. Thomas moved to the stand and traced the print with the pad of a finger, his thumb trembling under the dust. "Who else knew where that pendant lay?" Thomas' voice low. He kept his sentence short, naming the object and not the accusation. Bridget looked at Lady Evelyn's portrait across the room, at the strict line of the mouth, and felt the suspicion shift in her chest toward the angles of family power. They called for Lady Evelyn. The summons was a practical thing, a bowl set down in the hall, a handkerchief folded and left in plain sight, a single knock on the matron's door. Lady Evelyn appeared with a carriage of cool steadiness. She smoothed her skirts with the same practiced motion she used when uneasy, and she tapped the jet brooch between her fingers, as if tapping made thoughts come more precise. "What has happened?" Lady Evelyn, looking at the open doorway and at the absence on the harp's stand. Her voice held dignity and the restraint she wore like a second skin. Bridget could hear the measured cadence of her words, the careful breathing between them. Bridget spoke plainly. "The harp has sounded, Lady Evelyn. The stool is gone. The silver pendant is missing." She watched the widow's crease at the matriarch's brow. She watched how Lady Evelyn's hands remembered the morning locket at her throat and dialed down the heat of whatever she might say. Thomas did not wait for explanation. He moved to the fallen portrait frame that had crashed weeks before and had been carried to the study. He bent and pried at the back as he had on that earlier night. He handled the brittle paper with the same impatience that had pushed him into clumsy searching from the start. The folded scrap he found inside was narrow and smudged with a hurried hand. He read aloud, and every syllable made the room cold-dazzling burn. "Thomas," his voice flat as he sounded the name. "It says she was kept away to protect the family. It says." He stopped, the roughness in his throat holding the line. Bridget moved closer, looking for the rest of the sentence. The scrap named a rehearsed name and contained a short, grainy account that suggested Aisling had been silenced to avoid a scandal. Thomas' fingers closed on the paper, so tight that the edges bent. Lady Evelyn's face did not change at first. She held the same controlled posture, and then slowly her jaw worked. "We're preserving the house," she said. Each word measured kept what might harm the family hidden. That was the decision given then. Her tone did not carry regret as an adjective. It carried duty. Bridget heard, in the pause between Lady Evelyn's words, a refusal to say more edgety. "Thomas, you kept her away, Evelyn. You knew what was taken from that room." His voice rose in a single syllable. He used Lady Evelyn's name to strike at authority. "You sent her from the house. You closed the door and pretended silence." His movement grew clipped. His hands patted his coat pockets, seeking the warm weight of his worn silver watch as if it might steady him. Lady Evelyn's lips pressed flaties. She answered, The single word like a hinge made a choice then. I thought I was protecting this name. I cannot change what I chose in a younger state of mind. Her fingers touched the jet brooch and then moved to the little lacquered locket at her throat. He thought I was shielding you. Thomas. I thought I was keeping the house safe. Her voice did not break into confession. It folded around justification. Thomas stepped forward. You exiled her. He said you let her go with nothing but whatever she could carry. The accusation sharpened. Bridget watched Thomas' jaw set and saw his face grow red where the sea wind had already burned it. The suspicion that had sat in her hands now ignited into anger. She found herself speaking before she meant to. You named her inconvenient, Lady Eveline. You hid a girl in the name of honor. Her voice carried the steadiness of small oaths. Evelyn turned to Bridget then, and the three of them stood like pieces in a small, brutal game. Bridget, Eveline, calling the housekeeper by name as if to draw a line. You do not know the circumstances that made that choice necessary. I acted for my children. I acted for our survival. She watched Bridget's face for an outward sign of agreement and found none. The argument built into fast exchange. Thomas counted syllables, like blows. You mean your reputation. Thomas, you mean the family name. Lady Evelyn, you mean the truth hidden under a rug. Thomas, you mean exposure and ruin. Lady Evelyn. Bridget stepped between them. Stop, she said. Her voice clipped the back and forth and set new rhythm. This will not help Aisling. This will not bring answer tonight. She could feel the shift inside her, suspicion to resolve to act. Bridget's hands made decisions. She crossed to the study and found the iron key she had hidden under her apron months before. The one she'd secreted because she had feared what the house might ask her to deny. She had not meant to reveal it now. Her fingers closed on cold metal. The key sat heavy and real in her palm, and that weight changed the direction of the night. Thomas' face opened when she showed him the key. Bridget, he said, the name bared now with a keenness that bordered on gratitude and a new, painful expectation. He took the key and pressed it into the lock. The house seemed to hold its breath. Thomas turned the iron at the nursery door, and the tumblers clicked with a sound that was both small and enormous. The nursery gave up its final secret slowly. Inside, over the mattress, they found a small harp shaped like a child's instrument and clear in its neglect. One string had been freshly severed. Thomas drew the fragment between his fingers and found the thread of it still warm with the memory of recent motion. Under the mattress, tucked as if preserved by a child's own hand, they found a drawing, a crude sketch of the sea, and a girl with a harp pendant around her throat, and a name written afterward in a child's looping hand, Aisling. Bridget held the paper with fingers that trembled in the way of someone who has been expecting thunder and finds instead a single sharp bell. The discovery knocked the argument into a quieter shape, because the facts made argument petty. It placed Aisling back into material things, a harp with a cut string, a child's drawing, a pendant that matched the shape of the one missing. The evidence steered each of them toward choices. They carried the items to the main stairwell. Thomas placed the pendant on his palm as if it might dissolve. He turned it over, searching the small silver for any engraving. His thumb felt a faint set of marks, and then slowly he read the tiny inscription aloud to Aisling. So the music remembers, he said. The phrase landed in the stairwell like a small, decisive truth. The house answered with a sound that was not only wind. From the top of the main stairwell a figure materialized, luminous in a way that made the hair along Bridget's forearms stand up. It was a figure that moved without weight, fingers plucking at the air where a string might have been. Bridget's breath stalled. The figure's hair fell in soft waves. It wore a pale gown, and a small silver harp pendant flashed at its throat. The pendant slipped from the apparition and spun through the air to land at Thomas' feet. Bridget's immediate fear turned to a fierce, protective tenderness. She had washed sheets, mended hems, and kept the clocks from ever missing a chime. The thought of Aisling reduced to rumor and exile brought a rising, bitter clarity in her chest. Aisling, she said, using the name like a prayer and like a call. She wanted to know if the presence required solace, accusation, or acknowledgement. Thomas stooped and picked up the pendant. He pressed the piece of silver to the light, and the inscription confirmed what the scrap and the drawing suggested. His voice, when he spoke, turned quiet and raw. She belonged to us in ways we refused to admit. The anger that had sharpened earlier glossed into something else. Sorrow that translated into a solemn, practical need to repair. Lady Evelyn's face moved first in the outward ways of grief. Her fingers slipped from the jet brooch and touched the small lacquered locket at her throat. She unfastened it with a motion that had been practiced 100 times and turned it in her hand. The locket contained a pressed lock of hair. Lady Evelyn did not speak for a long beat. Then she reached out and, with fingers that trembled in a way Bridget had never seen, placed her mourning locket into Thomas' palm and eased the silver pendant onto the harp's empty place with a small, deliberate motion. "I thought I was protecting you, Lady Evelyn, at last." Her voice had lost its rigid reserve and had become something brittle, and honesty thought silence would spare us from scandal. "I did not think of what exile would do to her." She folded her hands and did not look away from the harp. Thomas closed his eyes. Grief passed over his features like wind. "You could have told me." He said, "You could have told me what was done in my name." His voice did not seek to wound as much as to demand truth. Bridget watched the change in him, accusation to grief to a steady, deliberate desire to make restitution. The house, which had contained their tidy lives of duty and hushed corners, began to shift. Bridget produced the iron key she had carried in her apron for a month, because she feared the law of silence. She had hidden it after the key had vanished from its peg the earlier evening. The revelation that she had the key felt like a betrayal and a relief all at once. Thomas took the key from her and unlocked the nursery door again to make sure nothing further had been left unsaid. Inside the nursery they found the small harp, and beneath it, a child's drawing folded and smoothed. Bridget unfolded the paper and read the child's scrawl aloud. "He will be home when the harp remembers," she read, voice steady but small. The words fell into the room and made the air heavier with what had been withheld. Thomas looked at Lady Evelyn and then down at the instrument. He did not speak for several breaths. Outside, the storm had driven the sea against the cliff with a long, repeated percussion. The sound acted as a metronome to their choices. Bridget listened to the waves and thought of Aisling's fingers plucking strings in a practiced dress, humming a tune that would not leave. She felt a shift in herself. Suspicion had led her to uncover, and now it moved into a different shape: protective resolve. She would not return to the pretense of cover. She would not tuck the metal key back under her apron and pretend the night had nothing to answer for. They carried the harp and the pendant to the stairwell and set the silver upon the small instrument. Lady Evelyn reached out with both hands and placed the mourning locket aside. Her fingers lingered over the pendant and the harp string that had been cut. She did not excuse herself now. The house let the truth stand naked, and she accepted that exposure as part of repair. Bridget watched Thomas place his hand over the harp and then on his mother's shoulder. He did not speak a long apology. Instead, he closed the small distance between him and Lady Evelyn and squeezed the fabric of her sleeve. The action was tangible, a reach for a new footing. Lady Evelyn's shoulders trembled once and then settled. Something in the household loosened and tightened in equal measure. Aisling's figure remained just visible on the stair, fingers miming plucked strings. She tilted her head in the way Bridget had seen her do at the piano when a measure caught wrong. She listened as if to a sound only she could hear. The presence did not speak, but the pendant on the harp sang faintly when the stair wind passed and gave a small, bell-like ring that made Thomas lower his head. He placed the pendant in the hollow of the harp, where it might be seen by the living and remembered by the house. Bridget felt the emotion inside her change twice more that night. Suspicion had driven her to the door. Resolve had made her produce the hidden key. Protective tenderness now shaped her movements as she straightened the small harp and moved a half step closer to the family she served. Each change showed in her hands. She smoothed the shawl over the crib corner as if smoothing an old wound, and she tucked the child's drawing into the crook of the harp, where a small future could find it. The actions were concrete and small, and they did what words could not. There was one surprise that had not been promised by the scrap, the drawing or the pendant. Under the harp's soundboard, they found a pressed scrap of paper with an address, an island cottage across the bay, and a brief line in an adult hand naming a ship that had left years before. The new piece of evidence rearranged an earlier assumption. It suggested Aisling had not been taken beyond memory by some unseen agency. She had been sent away on a specific voyage. Thomas held the paper and felt the sudden change in his plans, as if wind had shifted in a sail. She might have been moved rather than silenced. Thomas. The possibility changed the shape of their morning into a possible search. If there is a place she went, we can find it. We can follow the ship's name, find the cottage. His words carried a lean toward action that Bridget recognized. He met obstacles with movement too, should go at first light. We should send a carriage toward the harbor and ask after the vessel. He made decisions now instead of demands. Lady Evelyn's face took on a careful reserve. She lives, then she has been spared scandal at the cost of exile. Her hands folded. If she lives, we must ask forgiveness and offer restitution. I will go with you. The admission sounded like a small surrender, but it was the sound of someone making a moral exchange for what had been kept. Bridget felt the household contract and expand around the new plan. She would go to the harbor to watch the ships. She would speak to the men who read the logs and asked questions. The key had unlocked more than a door. It had forced choices for all of them, to hide or to seek, to shield or to own what was done. Bridget's lips set into a line of duty once more. She would do what she had always done, carry burdens, name facts plainly, and push the living toward action. They passed the night in a different sort of vigil. Thomas sat with the harp in his lap and turned the pendant in the small of his hand. Lady Evelyn did not sleep, but instead sat staring at the child's drawing as if mapping the girl's steps through the lines. Bridget made tea and served it in the hall. Each movement was a detail that kept the house tethered to ordinary life while truth moved through them. As dawn pulled itself up from the sea, the storm relented into a shy rain that misted the cliff grass. The family stood on the balcony overlooking the reef where the waves broke in white teeth against rock. Bridget held the iron key in one hand, as if by keeping it she might anchor the changes that had been made in the night. Thomas unfastened the small lacquered morning locket and handed it across to Lady Evelyn with a quiet, deliberate motion. Lady Evelyn accepted the locket. She opened it and looked at the pressed lock of hair inside. Then she set it down and removed her hands from the brooch at her throat. She did not make a speech. She did not call out to the absent. She removed the morning locket and placed it on the harp's small frame that Thomas had carried to the balcony. The pendant rested upon it like a returned thing. The action was small, specific, and public. Bridget watched the move and felt an odd lightness in the house's air. The sea kept its rhythm. The pendant shone pale under the wet dawn. Thomas looked out to the harbor, thinking already of ships and logs, and the men who would remember names. Lady Evelyn touched the locket once and then folded her hands. She met Thomas' eye, and in that look was a concession. She would answer for a choice she had made. The presence on the stair had faded by the time the sky blushed pink. Aisling's form was no longer visible. Her harp pendant lay in the small instrument where it could be seen and remembered. Bridget carried the child's drawing to the nursery and laid it beneath the crib mattress again. This time not to hide it, but to shelter it as a piece of history the house would keep with care. When Bridget turned from the nursery, she saw Thomas and Lady Evelyn standing together at the threshold, their silhouettes steady against the pale morning. Thomas folded the iron key into his palm and gave it back to Bridget. "Keep it safe," he said. "Naming her by the duty she fulfilled will need it again if we are to repair what was broken." His words were plain and immediate. Bridget took the key and slipped it under the same pocket where she had kept it before. She felt the metal's cold press against her fingers and understood that the night had moved something inside the house's order. She had started the evening with suspicion. By dawn she had acted, revealed hidden facts, and set a chain toward an outward search for Aisling. Her own part in the house's life had shifted. She would no longer hide evidence to keep peace. She would take the key, the facts, and the will to follow where they led. Lady Evelyn straightened her morning gown and reached without fuss to the brooch at her throat. Smoothing the cloth with a gesture that had a practical finality. "We leave at first light for the harbor," she said. "Speaking to both of them will find where she went. We will bring what can be brought back." The sentence was not heroic. It was a concrete plan. Bridget nodded. She had been the first to hear the harp and the first to notice the missing peg. She had been the one to carry a secret key and make the hard choice to use it. That night the house had given them a name, a pendant, a child's drawing, and a scrap that pointed the way. The facts could be followed. The wrongs might yet be answered. As they descended from the balcony toward the front hall, the pendant on the small harp caught the weak dawn and flashed once. It was a small movement, but it felt like an answer to the night's small music. Bridget set her hand on the stair rail and let the house hold her like a weight. The final sound of the chapter was not a word of closure, but a family making a choice to follow a trail beyond the Manor's cliff. Thomas already naming the harbor. Lady Evelyn folding her scarf and slipping her mourning locket into her pocket, and Bridget taking the iron key in a new, steady way. They stepped out into the rain as the carriage wheels creaked into the drive. The house watched them go. The harp's single string hung still, its severed end dry. The pendant rested on the little instrument, visible and returned. Bridget settled into the carriage and felt the cold metal in her palm, a small, precise weight of responsibility. She gave the key a small twist in her fingers and thought of the harbor and the cottage across the bay. The household had been reshaped by action, and now they would cross water to seek what had been hidden. The final movement of the chapter was a carriage turning toward the harbor, and the sound of rain against leather as they moved away from Moonfall Manor toward a place that might hold Aisling Barron's future.